Sign it, my son said, not even looking at me as he slid the papers across the polished oak table. The same table where I had served him birthday cakes and Sunday roasts for over 40 years, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him, that perhaps age had finally caught up with my hearing. But then he leaned back in his chair, calm, distant, like I was a stranger sitting in his house instead of his mother, and he repeated it, slower this time. You're not our responsibility anymore. And I felt something inside me go very still, not broken, not shattered, just quiet. As if every memory I had carefully held on to suddenly stepped back and waited. Thomas sat beside me, his hands folded, his face unreadable. The same man who once built this family from nothing now watching it dissolve without raising his voice. And I realized then that he had already accepted something I was only beginning to understand. Olivia stood near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, her expression polite but cold. The kind of smile you give when you've already decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. The room felt smaller than it used to. Or maybe it was just me, shrinking into a role I no longer recognized. I glanced down at the papers, legal language, clean and precise, words that turned a lifetime into a signature line, and I noticed how steady my hands were. No trembling, no hesitation, just a quiet clarity settling over me like the first snowfall of winter. I picked up the pen. The same pen Daniel had given his father years ago, engraved with "World's Best Dad." And I almost smiled at the irony. Almost. But instead I signed my name, Margaret Whitmore, in careful script, the way I had signed every school permission slip, every check, every document that kept this family running while no one was looking. I slid the papers back toward him without a word, and for the first time that evening, he looked at me, really looked, as if he had expected resistance, anger, something louder than silence. But I had nothing left to prove. We stood up together, Thomas and I, moving in quiet coordination that only comes from decades of shared life, and we walked out of that house with 2 suitcases, leaving behind the echo of everything we had once been. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp against my face, but it felt honest, cleaner than the warmth we had just left behind. We drove in silence for miles, past streets that no longer felt like ours, until the road narrowed and the city lights faded into darkness. And finally Thomas spoke, his voice low, steady. They think we lost everything. I turned my head and looked out at the silhouette of a structure, rising in the distance, forgotten, abandoned, a place we hadn't visited in years, its windows dark, its walls worn by time. And I felt that same quiet settle deeper inside me. Stronger now, more certain. I rested my hand against the cold glass of the car window and whispered, almost to myself, then let them think that. The mansion stood exactly where we had left it years ago, at the end of a narrow gravel road that no one seemed to use anymore, its outline faint against the early morning sky, tall windows dark and unwelcoming, the kind of place people passed by without a second glance. I stepped out of the car, and the cold air wrapped around me like a warning, or maybe an invitation. I could not tell which. Thomas walked ahead without hesitation, his footsteps steady on the frozen ground, and I followed, listening to the quiet crunch beneath my shoes, each step echoing louder than it should have, as if the silence here had been waiting for us. The front door resisted at first when he pushed it open, the wood stiff from years of neglect, but then it gave way with a low creak that carried through the empty halls. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in, the dust, the stillness, the faint smell of time that had settled into every corner. And I realized something unexpected. It did not feel abandoned, not entirely. It felt paused, like a breath held too long. Thomas set the suitcases down just inside the entrance and looked around, his eyes moving slowly from one wall to the next, measuring, remembering. I walked further in, my fingers brushing lightly against the banister of the staircase, a thin layer of dust coating my skin, and I did not pull away. I let it stay there, grounding me in a way I had not felt in a long time. The house was cold, colder than any place I had ever stood, but it was honest in its coldness. It did not pretend to be something it was not. I moved into what used to be the living room, the large windows still intact, though clouded, letting in a dull gray light that barely reached the far corners. I could picture it as it once was, filled with warmth, voices, movement. And for a brief moment, the memory stung, but it passed quickly. Replaced by something steadier, something quieter, Thomas joined me, his hands in his coat pockets, and he said, almost to himself, "They never knew about this place." I nodded slowly, because that was true. This house had never been part of the life we showed our children. It had been something we kept aside, not out of secrecy, but out of intention, a future we once thought we would share differently. I walked toward the fireplace, its stone surface cold and untouched, and I placed my hand against it, feeling the stillness beneath my palm. "We can make it warm again," I said, and the words did not sound like a question. Thomas looked at me then, really looked, the way he had not in years, and there was something in his expression I had almost forgotten, not doubt, not fear, but recognition, as if he was seeing the same thing I was beginning to see, not what we had lost, but what had been left untouched, waiting. I turned away from the empty room and toward the windows, wiping a small circle clear with the edge of my sleeve, letting in a narrow beam of light that cut through the dust. And for the first time since we left that dinner table, I felt something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to know that the story was not over, not yet. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the kind of quiet morning where even the air feels still, and for a moment I forgot where I was. But then the cold reminded me, settling into my bones as I opened my eyes to the unfamiliar ceiling above me, faint cracks running across it like lines on an old map. Thomas was already awake, sitting near the window with his coat still on, watching the pale light slowly push through the glass. Neither of us spoke right away. There was no need. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer heavy, just present, like something we were learning to live alongside. I stood up and walked across the wooden floor, each step echoing softly, and I realized how empty the house truly was. No hum of appliances, no distant voices, just the sound of movement and breath. I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth and looked around the room, taking in the details I had missed the night before, the faded wallpaper, the corners where dust had gathered undisturbed, the way the light struggled to fill the space. And yet there was something steady beneath it all, something that had not been touched by time or neglect. I moved toward the window and stood beside Thomas, following his gaze out across the overgrown yard, where frost still clung to the grass, untouched, undisturbed. "We should start with the windows," he said quietly, his voice calm, like he had already begun mapping out the work ahead. I nodded, not because I had a plan, but because the idea of doing something, anything, felt right. We spent the first hour opening windows that had been sealed shut for years, pushing against frames that resisted, letting in sharp air that cut through the stillness. And with each window that opened, the house seemed to shift slightly, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. I found an old cloth in one of the cabinets and began wiping the glass, slow, steady movements, clearing away layers of dust that had turned the outside world into a blur. And as the glass cleared, the light changed, growing stronger, more defined, casting long lines across the floor. Thomas worked in silence, his movements deliberate, careful, the way they always had been when he built something from the ground up, and I watched him for a moment, remembering the years when his hands shaped everything around us, homes, spaces, a life that once felt secure, and I realized that nothing about that part of him had changed. Not really. We paused only when the sun had fully risen, its light now filling the room in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath, and for the first time since we had arrived, I felt warmth, not from the house, but from something quieter, something building slowly beneath the surface. Thomas turned to me then and said, "This place still has good bones," and I almost smiled, because I understood what he meant, not just about the house, but about us. I walked toward the center of the room and looked around again, seeing it differently now, not as something abandoned, but as something unfinished, something waiting, and I realized that what we had stepped into was not an ending. It was a beginning that had been delayed, quietly, patiently, until now. I found the toolbox in the back storage room, exactly where Thomas used to keep it years ago, tucked beneath a workbench layered in dust, the metal cold when I lifted it, heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I was just more aware of the weight now. I carried it carefully into the main hall, where he was measuring the length of a wall, with a tape that clicked softly each time it retracted, the sound echoing in the stillness like a quiet rhythm. I set the toolbox down without saying anything and opened it, revealing tools that had not been touched in years, yet somehow still felt familiar, as if time had paused for them too. Thomas glanced over, his eyes settling on the worn handle of his old hammer, and for a brief moment, something softened in his expression, not nostalgia, not regret, just recognition. He picked it up and tested its weight, turning it once in his hand before nodding slightly. "Still good," he said. And that was all. We did not talk about the past directly, but it was there, woven into every movement, every decision. I began clearing the floor, pushing aside broken pieces of wood, gathering what could be salvaged into small piles, my hands moving steadily, methodically, the way they had when I used to keep our home in order, and I noticed how natural it felt. Not forced, not reluctant, just something I knew how to do. The hours passed quietly, marked only by the sound of tools, the scrape of wood, the occasional shift of furniture, and with each small task completed, the house responded, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The air moved differently. The light settled more clearly across the surfaces, as if the space itself was waking up. At one point I paused near the staircase, looking up at the second floor where shadows still lingered, untouched, waiting, and I felt a brief hesitation, not fear, just awareness of how much work still lay ahead. Thomas noticed and walked over. Standing beside me without speaking, we both looked upward for a moment. Before he said, "One step at a time," and I nodded, because that was all there was to do. No rushing, no forcing, just steady progress. I returned to the living room and began wiping down the mantel, each stroke of the cloth revealing the original color beneath the dust, a soft, warm tone that caught the light in a way I had not expected, and I realized then that the house had never truly lost what it was. It had only been hidden, covered over by years of silence, and something about that thought stayed with me. I moved from one surface to another, clearing, restoring, uncovering, and with each small change, I felt the same quiet shift within myself, as if I too had been waiting beneath layers I had not even noticed. By late afternoon, we stepped back and looked at the room together. It was still far from finished, still cold in places, still rough around the edges, but it was no longer empty. Not in the way it had been before. Thomas exhaled slowly, setting the hammer down on the table, and I followed his gaze across the room, seeing not what it was, but what it could become, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine it fully, not as something we had lost, but as something we were building again, piece by piece, without anyone else deciding its value for us. The next morning, Thomas asked me to check the study on the east side of the house, a room we had not opened in years, and I nodded without hesitation, carrying a small flashlight even though the daylight had already begun to fill the lower floors. The hallway leading there was narrower than I remembered, lined with closed doors that seemed to hold their breath as I passed, and when I reached the study, the door was stiff but not locked. It opened slowly with a quiet resistance, revealing a space that felt different from the rest of the house, less abandoned, more preserved, as if it had been waiting undisturbed. The desk stood near the window, covered in a thin layer of dust, papers stacked neatly to one side, not scattered like the rest of the house. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the sound soft but final, and for a moment I simply stood there, letting my eyes adjust, taking in the details, the shelves still filled with old files, the chair pushed in carefully, everything in its place. I moved toward the desk and brushed my fingers lightly across the surface, clearing a narrow line through the dust, and something about that simple gesture felt familiar, grounding. I opened the top drawer slowly, not expecting much, but inside were folders, labeled in Thomas's handwriting, dates, locations, documents organized with a precision that had always been his way. I pulled one out and set it on the desk, opening it carefully. Inside were property records, deeds, papers that traced back years, maybe decades, and as I flipped through them, a quiet realization began to form. This house had never been part of what we gave away, never included in the conversations we had with Daniel, never listed among the assets he thought he understood. I felt a slow, steady awareness settle over me. Not surprise, not shock, just clarity. I continued searching through the drawers, each one revealing more of the same. Records, plans, notes, all kept quietly, deliberately, and I understood then that this place had always been separate, not hidden, but protected, I gathered a few of the folders and carried them back to the main room where Thomas was working near the fireplace. He looked up as I approached, his eyes moving from the papers in my hands to my face, and without asking, he seemed to understand. I set the folders down on the table and opened them, spreading the documents out between us. He glanced over them briefly before nodding once, slow and certain. "It was never theirs," he said, his voice calm, almost matter of fact, and I felt something shift again, deeper this time, stronger. I looked at the papers, at the signatures, the dates, the quiet evidence of choices made long ago, and I realized that what we had lost the night we walked out of that house was not everything, not even close. We had only stepped away from what they believed we were worth. Thomas closed one of the folders and placed his hand on top of it, steady, grounded, and for a moment we stood there in silence, not heavy, not uncertain, just aware. I turned my gaze back toward the windows, where the light had grown warmer, stronger than it had been the day before, stretching further into the room, and I understood now that what we were rebuilding was not just a house. It was something they had never been able to take from us, something that had been waiting, quietly, for us to return and see it clearly. The days began to settle into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, but quickly became steady, almost grounding. Each morning starting with the same quiet routine, I would open the windows we had managed to unseal, letting in the crisp air that no longer felt harsh, but instead carried a sense of movement through the house. While Thomas worked on restoring the structure piece by piece, reinforcing what had weakened over time, I found myself drawn to the smaller details, the corners, the surfaces, the spaces that had been overlooked, and with each task completed, the house responded in subtle ways. The light stayed longer, the air felt less heavy, and the silence no longer pressed in the same way it once had. It shifted, becoming something we could move through instead of something that surrounded us. One afternoon, as I stood in the kitchen clearing out cabinets that had not been opened in years, I noticed how the sound of my movements carried differently now, no longer hollow, but softened, as if the space itself had begun to absorb life again. I paused, resting my hands on the counter, and allowed myself to take it in, the faint warmth beginning to gather, not from any source of heat, but from the presence of purpose. Thomas entered a few moments later, his sleeves rolled up, a thin layer of dust along his arms, and he placed a small box on the table. I looked at it, then at him, and he gave a slight nod. "Found it in the storage room," he said, and when I opened the box, I found old photographs, carefully stacked, edges worn but intact, images of a life that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. I lifted one, studying it closely, a younger version of us standing in front of this very house, the windows bright, the paint fresh, everything untouched by time. And for a moment, the memory rose clearly, not painful, not overwhelming, just present. I set the photograph down gently and closed the box, not because I wanted to forget, but because I understood that we were no longer looking back. We were building forward. Thomas watched me quietly, then turned his attention back to the work at hand, and I followed, returning to the cabinets, clearing, organizing, restoring. The hours passed without notice, marked only by the steady progress we made. And by evening, when we stepped back into the main room, there was a noticeable difference, not dramatic, but undeniable. The house no longer felt frozen, it felt in motion, like something waking slowly, piece by piece. I walked to the center of the room and looked around, seeing not the emptiness that had once defined it, but the structure beneath, the strength that had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. And as I stood there, I realized something else had changed, something quieter but just as real. The weight I had carried since that night, the silence that had followed us out of that house. It no longer felt like a loss. It felt like distance, space we had needed to see clearly. Thomas came to stand beside me, his presence steady, familiar, and without looking at me, he said, "They thought we would stop." I let the words settle for a moment before responding, my voice calm, certain. They never understood what we started with. And as the last light of the day filtered through the windows we had cleared, casting a soft glow across the room, I knew that what we were rebuilding here was not just a place to live. It was something far more enduring, something that had never depended on anyone else to exist. The sound came just after noon, faint at first, like something out of place in the stillness we had grown used to. I paused with the cloth in my hand, listening carefully, and then I heard it again, the distant hum of a car approaching along the gravel road, a sound that did not belong to this place. Not anymore. Thomas looked up from where he was working near the staircase, his expression unchanged, but I saw the way his shoulders stilled, the way he set his tools down with quiet precision. Neither of us spoke as the sound grew closer, louder, until it stopped just beyond the front entrance. And for a moment, everything went silent again, the kind of silence that feels different. Waiting, I walked toward the window and brushed aside the curtain we had only recently cleaned, looking out at the driveway where a car now sat, polished, familiar, out of place against the worn gravel and overgrown edges. I did not need to see who stepped out to know, but I watched anyway. Daniel first, adjusting his coat as if he had come for something routine. Olivia following just behind him, her movements measured, composed, as though nothing had changed, as though the last time we saw each other had not ended the way it did. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned to Thomas, who was already walking toward the front door, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. I followed a few steps behind, feeling that same quiet settle within me again, the one that had replaced everything else since we arrived here. He opened the door before they could knock, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. Daniel's eyes moved past us, scanning the interior, taking in the changes, the cleared space, the light that now filled the room, and I saw the flicker of something cross his face. Not surprise exactly, but recalculation. Olivia offered a small smile, polite, controlled. "We were in the area," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, as if this were a casual visit, as if the distance between us could be explained away with a simple sentence. Thomas stepped aside slightly, not as an invitation, but as acknowledgement, and they stepped in, their footsteps softer now against the floor we had begun to restore. Daniel moved further into the room, his gaze lingering on the windows, the walls, the structure itself, and I watched him take it in, not with memory, but with assessment, as if he were seeing it for the first time. Olivia remained closer to the entrance, her eyes moving more carefully, more deliberately, and I could sense the questions forming beneath her silence, the kind that are not asked directly, but measured, weighed. Thomas stood near the table where the documents still rested, his presence calm, grounded, and I moved to stand beside him, not in defense, not in confrontation, just where I belonged. Daniel finally turned to face us, his expression composed, but his tone slightly different now, softer, almost careful. "We did not realize you had this place," he said, and I met his gaze without hesitation, feeling no need to explain, no need to fill the silence that followed. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. They had come back not for us, but for what they had just discovered, and that changed everything. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the table, steady, certain, and waited, not for their words, but for what they would reveal next. Daniel took a slow step closer to the table, his eyes settling on the documents spread across it, not touching them yet, just looking, as if trying to understand something he had missed, something that had been there all along without his knowledge. Olivia followed more carefully, her gaze sharper now, no longer polite, no longer distant, but focused, calculating in a way that felt familiar. Though I could not remember when I had first noticed it, perhaps it had always been there, just beneath the surface. "This place," Daniel began, his voice trailing slightly as he glanced around again. "It must be worth a lot now." The words hung in the air, heavier than they sounded, and I realized then that he was not asking. He was measuring. Thomas remained still beside me, his expression unchanged, his presence steady like the foundation beneath the house itself. I did not respond right away. I let the silence stretch just enough for the meaning behind his words to settle. Olivia stepped forward then, her tone softer, but more direct. "We were thinking," she said, choosing each word carefully. "Maybe it would be better if everything was handled together as a family." I felt a faint shift inside me, not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity, the kind that removes all uncertainty. I looked at her, then at Daniel, and for the first time, I saw them not as they had been, but as they were, standing in a space they had never valued until they saw its worth. Thomas reached for one of the folders on the table and opened it. Slowly, his movements deliberate, not rushed, not defensive, just precise. He turned it slightly so they could see. The documents laid out clearly. Dates, signatures, everything in order. Daniel leaned in, his expression tightening as he read, and Olivia's posture shifted, her confidence pulling back just enough to reveal something else beneath it, something less certain. This property, Thomas said calmly, his voice even, was never part of what you thought it was. Daniel straightened his eyes, moving from the papers to his father, searching for something that was no longer there. Perhaps permission, perhaps authority. I rested my hand lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, steady, grounded, and I spoke then, my voice quiet but clear. We did not hide it from you, I said. You simply never asked about what you could not see. The words settled between us, not sharp, not harsh, just true. Olivia took a small breath, her expression composed again, but different now, more cautious. We only meant, she began, but I did not need her to finish. Thomas closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, the soft sound final in a way that words could not be. Daniel glanced around the room once more, but this time his gaze did not linger. It moved quickly, unsettled, as if the space no longer belonged to his understanding, and in that moment, I saw it clearly. They had come expecting something familiar, something they could step back into, but what they found was something else entirely, something that no longer included them in the way they had assumed. I stepped slightly forward, not to confront, not to push, but simply to stand where I needed to stand, and I understood then that this moment was not about what we had lost. It was about what we had chosen to keep, and what we were no longer willing to give away. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak again, but no words came out at first, only a quiet hesitation that did not belong to the version of him I remembered, the one who used to fill every silence with certainty. Olivia stepped slightly closer to him, her hand brushing his arm in a subtle gesture, not comfort, but coordination, and I saw it clearly now, the way they moved together, not as family, but as partners in something carefully measured. We just think, Daniel finally said, his voice lower, less certain than before, that it would make sense to keep things connected. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, because the meaning beneath his words had already settled. Thomas remained beside me, unmoving, his presence steady, and I felt no need to look at him to know that he understood as well. Olivia took a small step forward, her expression composed again, but there was a tightness around her eyes now, something controlled. It is still family property in a way, she added, her tone even, almost reasonable, as if the past could be rearranged through careful phrasing. I let a moment pass before responding, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the silence to hold its weight. No, I said quietly, the word simple, without emphasis, but it settled into the room with a clarity that needed no explanation. Daniel's expression shifted, not sharply, but enough to reveal something beneath the surface, something unsettled. Mom, he began, and the word felt unfamiliar, distant, as if it belonged to another time. I met his gaze, steady, not unkind, but no longer searching for something that was not there. This was never yours, I continued, my voice calm, measured, and it is not something that can be included now just because you see it differently. Olivia's posture stiffened slightly, her composure holding, but thinner now. We are only trying to be practical, she said, and I almost recognized the tone, the same one she used when decisions were made without asking, when conclusions were presented as if they were already agreed upon, but that no longer held the same weight. Thomas reached for the edge of the table, resting his hand there briefly before stepping forward, just enough to stand fully beside me, not in front, not behind, but aligned. You made your decision, he said, his voice steady, not raised, not sharp, and we accepted it. The words were not an accusation, not a challenge, just a statement, clear and complete. Daniel looked between us, his gaze moving quickly now, searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reclaim. The room itself seemed to reflect that, the light steady, the space no longer uncertain. Olivia took a small breath, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if recalculating once more. But this time there was nowhere for that calculation to settle. I stepped forward then, not to close the distance, but to define it, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Grounding, certain. We wish you well, I said, and the words felt complete, not forced, not softened, just true. Daniel hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small, uncertain movement that did not quite reach his eyes. Olivia turned first, her posture composed again, controlled, and he followed, their footsteps quiet as they moved toward the door, and when they stepped outside, the air seemed to shift again, not heavier, not lighter, just clear. Thomas closed the door slowly, the sound soft but final, and for a moment we stood there in the stillness that followed, not empty, not uncertain, just complete. I turned back toward the room, the light steady across the floor, the space no longer waiting, and I understood then that some doors do not need to be reopened, not because of what was lost, but because of what had finally been found.